The Conspiracy in the Shadows. The marble halls of the Palatine Hill Palace echoed with whispered conversations that autumn morning in 192 AD. Emperor Commodus, draped in his purple-trimmed toga, stood before the massive windows overlooking the sprawling city of Rome. The October wind carried the scent of burning olive wood from the countless hearths below, mixing with the ever-present aroma of the Tiber River that snaked through the heart of the empire. "My lord," came the gravelly voice of Quintus Aemilius Latus, prefect of the Praetorian Guard. His weathered face bore the scars of countless battles fought in Germania and Britannia. The morning reports from the city prefect. Commodus turned slowly, his once handsome features now bloated from years of excess. His eyes, bloodshot from the previous night's festivities, narrowed as he studied his most trusted commander. The emperor had grown increasingly paranoid in recent months, seeing enemies in every shadow, conspirators behind every pillar. "Tell me, Latus," Commodus said, his voice carrying the dangerous edge that had become all too familiar to those who served him. "What do you hear in the streets? What do the people say about their emperor?" Latus shifted uncomfortably, his bronze breastplate catching the morning light streaming through the windows. Behind him stood Marcus Aurelius Cleander, the emperor's chamberlain, a freedman whose influence had grown immense over the past years. Cleander's dark eyes darted between the emperor and the Praetorian prefect, calculating, always calculating. "The people, they speak of the gladiatorial games, my lord. They praise your victories in the arena," Latus replied carefully, though his voice lacked conviction. Commodus laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the frescoed walls depicting his father's military triumphs. How different Marcus Aurelius had been, the philosopher-emperor who had brought peace and wisdom to Rome. Now his son ruled through fear and spectacle. "Do they now?" Commodus stepped closer to Latus, close enough that the prefect could smell the wine still heavy on the emperor's breath. "And what of the senators? What of my dear, loyal senators?" The question hung in the air like incense smoke. Everyone in the room knew the truth. The Senate despised Commodus. His erratic behavior, his obsession with gladiatorial combat, his wasteful spending on games and personal pleasures, had drained the imperial treasury and brought shame upon the office that Marcus Aurelius had held with such dignity. Cleander spoke for the first time, his voice smooth as silk. "Perhaps, Caesar, it would be wise to discuss certain concerns that have come to our attention." Commodus whirled around, his purple cloak billowing dramatically. "Concerns? What concerns?" "There are whispers, my lord," Cleander continued, moving closer with the careful steps of a man walking on thin ice. "Whispers of discontent among those closest to you, even among the Praetorian Guard." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Latus felt his hand instinctively move toward his gladius, though he caught himself before the gesture became obvious. The Praetorian Guard had been the backbone of imperial power for nearly 2 centuries, their loyalty bought with generous donatives and their oath sacred. "Impossible," Commodus hissed, but his eyes betrayed his uncertainty. "The Guard swore an oath to me personally. They received double pay, the finest quarters, the best equipment. They would never—" "My lord," Latus interrupted, his voice steady despite the growing tension. "I can vouch for every man under my command. We have served your family faithfully since your father's reign. My own son serves in the 2nd cohort." But Cleander was not finished. From beneath his toga he produced a small scroll, its wax seal broken. "This was intercepted yesterday, Caesar. A letter from a centurion in the 1st cohort to his brother in Gaul." Commodus snatched the scroll, his hands trembling slightly as he unrolled it. As he read, his face grew pale, then flushed red with rage. The letter spoke of shame, of duty conflicted with loyalty, of prayers to the gods that wisdom might return to the throne of Rome. "Marcus Junius Brutus," Commodus read aloud, his voice rising with each word. "Centurion of the 1st cohort writes to his brother, I can no longer watch as Rome bleeds while our emperor plays at being a gladiator. The time may come when we must choose between our oath to the man and our duty to Rome itself." The scroll fell from Commodus's hands, fluttering to the mosaic floor like a wounded bird. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant sounds of the city beyond the palace walls. Merchants hawking their wares, children playing in the streets, life continuing as it had for generations. Latus stepped forward, his face grave. "My lord, Brutus is a good soldier, but he speaks only for himself. The guard remains loyal." "Does it?" Commodus's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more menace than any shout. "How many others share his concerns? How many of my supposedly loyal guardsmen discuss treason in their barracks?" Cleander moved to retrieve the fallen scroll, his movements deliberate and theatrical. "Caesar, perhaps it would be prudent to investigate further, to root out any disloyal elements before they can spread their poison." Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the 7 hills of Rome. The wind had picked up, rattling the shutters and causing the flames in the oil lamps to flicker ominously. It seemed as though even the gods were holding their breath, waiting to see what the emperor would decide. Commodus walked to his chair, not quite a throne, but elevated enough to remind everyone of his supreme authority. He sat heavily, the purple cushions sighing under his weight. For a long moment, he stared at the 2 men before him. Latus, the career soldier whose loyalty had never been questioned, and Cleander, the ambitious freedman who had whispered poison in his ear for months. "Summon the centurions," Commodus finally said, his voice cold as winter marble. "All of them. I want every officer of the Praetorian Guard assembled in the courtyard within the hour." Latus bowed deeply. "It shall be done, Caesar." As the prefect hurried from the room, Cleander remained behind, a thin smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He had planted the seed, and now he would watch it grow into something that would reshape the very foundations of imperial power. The die had been cast, and Rome would never be the same. The courtyard of the Praetorian barracks had never seemed smaller than it did that gray October afternoon. 53 centurions stood in perfect formation, their polished armor gleaming despite the overcast sky. These were the elite of the elite, men who had commanded respect from Britain to Syria, who had bled for Rome in a dozen campaigns, who had sworn sacred oaths to defend the emperor with their lives. Marcus Junius Brutus stood in the front rank, his weathered face betraying nothing of the turmoil within. At 45, he was one of the oldest centurions, a veteran of the German wars who bore the scars of service across his arms and chest. His son served in his century, a young man of barely 20 who looked up to his father with the devotion that had built the Roman legions. Emperor Commodus emerged from the palace accompanied by a full century of Germanic bodyguards, foreign mercenaries whose loyalty was bought with gold rather than earned through Roman honor. The message was clear. The emperor no longer trusted his own Praetorian Guard. "Centurions of Rome," Commodus began, his voice carrying across the courtyard despite the wind that whipped his purple cloak around his legs. "You stand before your emperor, the son of Marcus Aurelius, the chosen of the gods themselves." The assembled officers remained silent, their discipline absolute despite the growing unease that rippled through their ranks like a stone thrown into still water. Cleander stepped forward, carrying a small wooden box that seemed to draw all eyes like a magnet. "Caesar has discovered a conspiracy," he announced, his voice cutting through the afternoon air. "A plot against the divine person of the emperor, hatched in the very heart of the Praetorian Guard." Brutus felt his blood turn to ice. Beside him, his fellow centurions shifted almost imperceptibly, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons before remembering where they were. "Treason," Commodus spat, the word hanging in the air like a death sentence. "The most heinous crime known to Roman law, the betrayal of the trust placed in you by the Senate and people of Rome." From the wooden box, Cleander produced not just one letter, but dozens. Scrolls and wax tablets, personal correspondence that should never have seen the light of day. Private thoughts expressed to wives, brothers, friends, all seized by the emperor's agents in a coordinated sweep of the centurions' quarters. "Marcus Junius Brutus," Commodus called out, his voice filled with theatrical outrage. "Step forward." Every head turned as Brutus left his position and marched to the center of the courtyard. His hobnailed sandals clicked against the stone with the precision that had been drilled into him over 25 years of service. He stopped precisely 6 feet from the emperor and saluted with mechanical perfection. "You wrote to your brother in Gaul," Commodus continued, unrolling the familiar scroll. "You expressed doubts about your emperor's wisdom." "I did, Caesar," Brutus replied, his voice steady. I wrote as a concerned Roman citizen to my blood relative. The admission sent a ripple of shock through the assembled centurions. In the Roman military, honesty was valued above almost all other virtues, but in this moment, it might prove fatal. Concerned? Commodus's voice rose to nearly a shriek. You call it concern when you question the judgment of your divinely appointed emperor? When you suggest that your oath of loyalty might be conditional? Cleander stepped closer to Brutus, close enough that the centurion could see the satisfaction gleaming in the freedman's dark eyes. This had been planned, orchestrated from the beginning. The chamberlain had been reading their private correspondence for months, building a case, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And you are not alone, Commodus continued, his voice dropping to a more dangerous whisper. Gaius Valerius Maximus wrote to his wife expressing shame at serving in the arena with his emperor. Lucius Cornelius Sulla questioned the wisdom of spending the imperial treasury on games while the northern borders remain undermanned. With each name called, another centurion stepped forward. Good men, loyal soldiers, Romans who had given their lives to the service of the empire. Their only crime had been speaking their minds in what they thought were private moments with loved ones. By the time Commodus finished reading, 23 centurions stood isolated in the center of the courtyard. Nearly half of the Praetorian centurions, men whose combined experience represented over 4 centuries of military service to Rome. The penalty for treason is death, Commodus announced, his words falling like hammer blows. But I am a merciful emperor. I offer you a choice. He gestured to the Germanic guards, who stepped forward with grim efficiency. In their hands were not swords, but gladiatorial weapons, the tools of the arena that had become Commodus's obsession. Fight, the emperor commanded. Fight each other until only half remain standing. The survivors will be stripped of rank and exiled to the furthest corners of the empire. The fallen will die with what honor remains to them. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as the implications of the emperor's command sank in. These men had served together, bled together, shared the bonds of brotherhood that could only be forged in battle. Now they were being ordered to kill each other for the entertainment of a mad emperor. Caesar. Prefect Latus stepped forward, his face pale but determined. These men have served Rome faithfully. Surely exile alone would suffice. Silence! Commodus roared, spittle flying from his lips. You dare question my judgment, Latus? Perhaps you should join them in the center of the courtyard. The threat hung in the air like a sword suspended by a thread. Latus had served 3 emperors, had never wavered in his loyalty, but he could see his own doom reflected in Commodus's wild eyes. Brutus looked around at his fellow centurions, seeing his own despair reflected in their weathered faces. These were not criminals or cowards. They were the backbone of Roman military power, men who had dedicated their lives to service and honor. My lord, Brutus said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, we are Roman soldiers. We will not shed the blood of our brothers for your amusement. The words were barely out of his mouth when Commodus's face turned purple with rage. With a gesture, he signaled to his Germanic guards. The foreign soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, surrounding the defiant centurions with drawn swords. Then you choose death, Commodus snarled. So be it. Let it be recorded that on this day, the Emperor Commodus rooted out treason from the very heart of his guard. What followed was not a battle but a massacre. The Germanic guards fell upon the centurions like wolves upon sheep. These were not gladiatorial games with rules and ceremony. This was butchery, pure and simple. The best of Rome's military leadership died in a courtyard that had seen centuries of honor and tradition, cut down by foreign mercenaries at the whim of a madman. Brutus died with his son's name on his lips, the young man he had trained and guided now watching in horror from the ranks of surviving guardsmen. Valerius Maximus fell clutching a letter from his wife, stained now with his own blood. One by one, the centurions perished, their deaths witnessed by men who would carry the memory for the rest of their lives. When the killing finally stopped, 23 of Rome's finest officers lay dead in the courtyard of their own barracks. The surviving centurions stood in shocked silence, their faces pale with horror and shame. They had watched their brothers die and done nothing. What did that make them? Commodus surveyed the carnage with satisfaction, stepping carefully around the pools of blood that stained the ancient stones. Let this be a lesson. he announced to the surviving guardsmen. "This is the price of disloyalty. This is what happens to those who question their emperor." As the emperor and his entourage departed, leaving the survivors to dispose of the bodies, Prefect Latus remained behind. The old soldier looked around at the courtyard where he had served for over a decade, now transformed into a charnel house. The Germanic guards began the grisly work of removing the bodies, treating the fallen centurions like discarded refuse rather than honored soldiers. The blood would be washed away with buckets of water from the barracks wells, but the stain on Roman honor would prove impossible to cleanse. That night, as Rome slept uneasily under a canopy of stars, the surviving members of the Praetorian Guard gathered in whispered conversations. The emperor had thought to cow them with his display of ruthless power, but instead, he had planted the seeds of his own destruction. For in killing his most loyal officers, Commodus had committed the one unforgivable sin in Roman politics. He had made it clear that no one, no matter how faithful, no matter how honorable, was safe from his paranoid rage. The conspiracy that would eventually claim his life began that very night, born not from ambition or greed, but from the simple recognition that the empire could not survive under a ruler who would murder his own guardians. 3 months later, on the last day of 192 AD, Emperor Commodus would be strangled in his bath by Narcissus, a wrestler turned assassin. The plot was organized by the very people he had trusted most, his mistress Marcia, his chamberlain Eclectus, and Prefect Latus himself. The most ruthless decision Commodus ever made had indeed been against his own royal guard. In trying to secure his power through terror, he had instead sealed his own fate, proving that in Rome, as in all of history, those who rule by fear ultimately fall to the very forces they sought to control. The courtyard of the Praetorian barracks would be rebuilt, new centurions would be appointed, and life would continue. But the memory of that October afternoon would linger in the collective consciousness of Rome, a reminder that even emperors are not beyond the reach of justice, and that the gods themselves will not tolerate the murder of the innocent indefinitely. The empire would survive Commodus, as it had survived other mad emperors before him. But the Praetorian Guard would never forget the day their loyalty was repaid with blood, and the lesson they learned would echo through the halls of power for generations to come. Trust, once broken, can never truly be repaired.